The White Death, the tragedy of the Donner Party. Prologue. The Silence of the Sierras, February 1847. The Sierra Nevada Mountains, California. The snow was 20 feet deep. It buried the trees. It buried the rocks. It buried the hope of 87 people. 7 men, a rescue party from California, were hiking up the frozen slopes on snowshoes. They were shouting, their voices echoing off the granite cliffs. They were looking for a wagon train that had vanished months ago. They crested a ridge and looked down into a bowl-shaped valley surrounding a frozen lake. It was silent. There was no smoke rising from fires. There were no sounds of cattle. "They're gone," one rescuer whispered. "Tarried." Then a hole in the snow appeared. A woman, skeletal, with skin like parchment stretched over bone, climbed out of the white abyss. She looked at the rescuers with eyes that had seen things no human should ever see. "Are you men from California, or are you from heaven?" The rescuers looked around the camp. They saw the scattered bones. They saw the pots boiling on the fires. And they realized, with a sickening jolt, what was in the pots. This is the story of how they got there. It is the story of the American dream turned into an American nightmare. Chapter 1. The Fatal Optimism. Spring 1846. Independence, Missouri. The year 1846 was the height of Oregon fever and California fever. Thousands of Americans were selling their farms, packing their lives into covered wagons, and heading west. Among them were 2 wealthy brothers from Springfield, Illinois, George and Jacob Donner. George was 62 years old, an old man for the frontier. He was kind, wealthy, and optimistic. He packed his wagon with fine wines, silks, and books. He sewed thousands of dollars in cash into a quilt. He wasn't planning on just surviving the trip. He was planning on arriving in style. Joining them was James Reed, a fiery, intelligent, and arrogant businessman. Reed had built a magnificent 2-story wagon for his sick wife and children. It had a stove, cushioned seats, and sleeping bunks. The other immigrants called it the Palace Car. They left Independence in May. The grass was green, the spirits were high. It was a grand adventure. But James Reed had a book in his pocket. It was The Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California, written by a man named Lansford Hastings. Hastings was a promoter, not a guide. He had never actually traveled the full route he was advertising. In his book, he claimed there was a shortcut south of the Great Salt Lake that would shave 300 miles off the journey. He wrote, "It is a fine, level road with plenty of water and grass." It was a lie that would kill half of them.
Chapter 2. The Parting of Ways. July 18th, 1446, Fort Bridger, Wyoming. The wagon train reached the Continental Divide. This was the decision point. The established route, the Oregon Trail, went north through Idaho via Fort Hall. It was long, safe, and reliable. The Hastings cutoff went south through the Wasatch Mountains and the Salt Lake Desert. Jim Bridger, the famous mountain man who ran the fort, told Reed that the shortcut was doable. Bridger, it turned out, was business partners with Hastings. He wanted travelers to take the southern route because it brought them to his fort. Most of the wagon trains on the trail that year turned north toward Fort Hall. They chose safety. But the Donners and the Reeds were in a hurry. They were slightly behind schedule. They wanted to beat the snow. "We'd take the cutoff," Reed declared. On July 20th, 87 people, men, women, and dozens of children, turned their wagons south. They were the Donner Party now. and they had just sealed their fate. Chapter 3. The Hacking. The fine level road promised by Hastings didn't exist. Almost immediately, they hit the Weber Canyon. It was a rugged, choked wilderness of boulders and brush. There was no trail. The men had to chop a road through the forest by hand. They spent days hacking down trees, moving rocks, and dragging wagons up steep slopes. Progress slowed to a crawl. They were moving 1 or 2 miles a day. The oxen were getting tired. The tempers were flaring. Hastings, who was guiding a group ahead of them, had left a note on a bush advising them to find a different route through the mountains. Reed rode ahead to find Hastings. When he returned, he led them through an even worse pass. It took them 21 days to cover 36 miles. By the time they emerged from the Wasatch Mountains, the cattle were exhausted and the summer was fading. And ahead of them lay the Great Salt Lake Desert. August 30th, 1446. Lansford Hastings had written that the desert crossing was 40 miles. It would take 2 days. They filled their water barrels and started across the gray, shimmering salt flats. 40 miles came and went. There was no water, just endless, blinding white salt. The wheels of the heavy wagons broke through the salt crust, sinking into the toxic mud beneath. The oxen began to go mad with thirst. On the 3rd day, the mirages started. They saw lakes that weren't there. On the 4th day, James Reed's oxen panicked. They broke their yokes and stampeded into the desert, vanishing into the night. Reed was left with his family and his palace car, stranded in the middle of nowhere, without animals to pull them. It took 6 days to cross the desert. It was actually 80 miles, not 40. They survived, but the cost was high. 36 oxen were dead or lost. Several wagons had to be abandoned. The psychological toll was immense. The group began to fracture. They stopped acting like a community and started acting like rival families. They were now weeks behind schedule. September was ending. The mountains loomed ahead. Chapter 5. The First Blood. October 5th, 1446. Iron Point, Nevada. Stress brings out the worst in men. As the ragged train moved along the Humboldt River, John Reed got into an argument with a teamster named John Snyder. Snyder was beating his oxen with a whip handle. Reed told him to stop. Snyder turned the whip on Reed, striking him in the head. Reed drew a knife. In a blur of violence, Reed stabbed Snyder in the chest. Snyder stumbled a few feet and died. The mob was in an uproar. Snyder was popular. Reed was arrogant and disliked. The mob wanted to hang Reed right there on the wagon tongue. Kesseberg, a German immigrant who hated Reed, propped up the wagon tongue to use as a gallows. But Reed's wife pleaded for his life. The group compromised. They banished him. "You will leave this train. You will go out into the wilderness alone. If we see you again, we will kill you." James Reed kissed his sick wife and his children goodbye. He took a horse and a rifle and rode west, alone. He was the strongest leader they had, and they had just kicked him out. Ironically, this banishment would save his life and give the others their only hope of rescue. Chapter 6. The Race Against Winter. October 1846. The Donner Party was now leaderless, demoralized, and starving. They were still in Nevada. They looked at the Sierra Nevada mountains in the distance. The peaks were already dusted with white. The native Paiute Indians, seeing the weakness of the group, began to shadow them. They didn't attack outright. They waged a war of attrition. At night, they would sneak in and shoot arrows into the oxen, crippling them. By morning, the pioneers would find their animals dead. They lost nearly 100 animals to the attacks. They had to lighten the loads. They threw furniture, books, and heirlooms into the desert dust. They were walking now, forcing the remaining oxen to pull the meager food supplies. October 31, Halloween. They reached the base of the pass. It was later called Donner Pass. The sky turned a leaden gray. The temperature plummeted. An old mountain man they met on the trail gave them a warning. "Cross now. Do not stop. If the snow flies, you die." They pushed the oxen hard. They made it to the foot of the lake, now Donner Lake, just 1,000 feet below the summit. They rested for the night. They planned to go over the top in the morning. That night, it started to rain. Then the rain turned to slush. Then the slush turned to snow. Chapter 7. The Trap Closes. November 1, 1846. When they woke up, there was 5 feet of snow on the ground. Panic set in. They yoked the oxen and tried to drive them up the steep, rocky face of the pass, but the animals floundered in the deep powder. The wagon slipped on the hidden ice. They couldn't find the trail. It was buried. The families were scattered. The Breen, Graves, and Reed families were at the lake. The Donner brothers, George and Jacob, had broken a wagon axle 5 miles back at Alder Creek. They were stuck there. They tried again the next day. The snow was deeper. And then the storm truly hit. It snowed for 8 days straight. When the sky finally cleared, the pass was blocked by a 20-foot wall of white. They were trapped. They were on the wrong side of the mountain. They had entered the snow hells. Chapter 8. The Cabins of Despair. They realized they weren't going anywhere. They had to build shelters. At the lake, they found a crude cabin built by a previous party 2 years earlier. The Breen family moved in. The others built rough lean-tos and log shanties. They covered the roofs with ox hides and canvas. The cabins were dark, smoky, and damp. They had no windows. The snow piled up so high it covered the roofs. They lived in ice caves. At Alder Creek, the Donners were worse off. They didn't have time to build cabins. They made tents out of brush and quilts. They huddled under the trees while the snow buried them alive. The food supply was critical. They had killed most of the oxen, but the meat was lean and tough. They stacked the frozen carcasses in the snowbanks. "It will be enough," one man said. "The government will send a rescue party." But down in California, the Mexican-American War was raging. All the able-bodied men were fighting. No one knew the Donner Party was stuck. James Reed, who had made it safely to California, was trying desperately to raise a rescue party. But the snow in the mountains was impassable even for horses. He tried to hike up, but the drifts were too deep. He had to turn back. He stared at the white peaks, knowing his wife and children were freezing on the other side. Chapter 9. The Forlorn Hope. December 15th, 1846. 6 weeks had passed. The oxen meat was gone. The people at the lake were boiling the ox hides. They would cut the hair off the rawhide, boil the leather into a glue-like paste, and eat it. It provided almost no nutrition. The children were crying from hunger. The adults were growing weak. A group of the strongest men and women decided to make a desperate break for it. They would make snowshoes out of ox bows and rawhide. They would walk over the snow, reach California, and bring back help. There were 17 of them, 10 men, 5 women, 2 young boys. They called themselves the Forlorn Hope. They took 6 days of starvation rations, a few strips of dried beef. They carried blankets and an axe. They climbed the pass on their primitive snowshoes. They made it over the top. But they didn't know that the journey to the nearest settlement wasn't 40 miles. It was 100 miles through the most rugged terrain in America. On the third day, the food ran out. On the fourth day, the snow blindness set in. On the sixth day, a new storm hit. They huddled together under a blanket in the middle of a blizzard. The fire went out. They were freezing to death. Antonio, a Mexican herder, died first. Then Uncle Billy Graves died. The survivors sat in the dark next to the warm bodies of their friends. They were insane with hunger. Someone, history isn't sure who, spoke the words first, whispered the unthinkable. If we don't eat, we all die. Patrick Dolan, a bachelor, stripped off his shirt. "Kill me," he said. "Eat me. Save the women." They couldn't do it. Not yet. But nature made the choice for them. Dolan went mad, ran into the snow, and froze. A young boy, Lemuel Murphy, died in his sister's arms. The storm cleared. The survivors took the knife. They cut the flesh from the arms and legs of the dead bodies. They roasted it over the fire. They turned their backs so they wouldn't see who they were eating, but they ate. This was the camp of death. Chapter 10. The Human Wolf. Back at the cabins, the situation was deteriorating into horror. Those who refused to eat the hide glue starved. Those who ate the hide glue got sick. Jacob Donner died at Alder Creek. Then others followed. The snow was now so deep, over 15 feet, that they couldn't find the bodies of the cattle they had buried. They were probing the snow with poles, but finding nothing. In the Murphy cabin, Milt Elliott died. He was a teamster, strong and loyal. The family dragged his body up out of the hole in the snow and left it on the surface. Then the unthinkable began to happen in the cabins too. They began to eat the dogs, then the mice, and then they looked at the bodies in the snow. There is a biological imperative to survive. When the body consumes its own fat, then its own muscle, the brain chemistry changes, moral codes evaporate. At Alder Creek, the survivors began to eat the bodies of those who died. But one man, Louis Caseberg, the German who had wanted to hang Reed, seemed to take to it with disturbing ease. He was living in a cabin with others, but as they died, he survived. He became the boogeyman of the Donner Party.
The Rescue and the Ruin. Chapter 11. The Skeletons in the Village. January 1847. The Sacramento Valley. Of the 17 members of the Forlorn Hope who had marched out on snowshoes, only 7 remained, 2 men and 5 women. They had been walking for 33 days. They were walking skeletons. They had eaten their dead companions. They had eaten their moccasins. On January 17th, they stumbled into a Miwok Indian village. The Native Americans, terrified by the sight of these emaciated, weeping figures who looked like ghosts, initially ran away, but they returned. They saw the desperation. They fed the survivors acorn bread and guided them to Johnson's Ranch, the nearest white settlement. William Eddy, the strongest of the group, couldn't walk. He crawled the last miles, leaving bloody trails in the dirt. When he reached the cabin door, he gasped out one sentence before collapsing. "They are starving in the mountains." The news hit California like a thunderclap. The war with Mexico was winding down, and now the plight of the Donner Party became the singular focus of the territory. James Reed, the banished leader, was already organizing a relief party. Now he knew exactly where they were. But the weather was the enemy. Every time they tried to launch a rescue, a new blizzard slammed a door shut. Chapter 12. The First Relief. February 18th, 1847. 7 men, led by Aquila Glover and Reeson Tucker, finally crested the Donner Pass. They were carrying heavy packs of food, flour, jerky, and coffee. They looked down at the lake. It was a sheet of white ice. The cabins were completely buried. Only the tops of the chimneys poked through the snow. It looked like a graveyard. They shouted. From a hole in the snow, a woman emerged. It was Mrs. Murphy. She looked at them with a vacant stare. "Are you men from California, or do you come from heaven?" The rescuers slid down the slopes to the cabins. The smell hit them first. It was the smell of death, unwashed bodies, and rotting ox hides. They distributed the food, but they had to be careful. If they let the starving people eat too much, they would die of refeeding syndrome. The rescuers made a hard decision. They couldn't carry everyone out. They could only take those who could walk. "We take the children and a few mothers to care for them," Glover said. They chose 23 people, mostly children. The parting scenes were heart-wrenching. Margaret Reed, James Reed's wife, was chosen to go, but she had to leave 2 of her children, Patty and Tommy, behind because they were too weak to walk. "I will come back for you," she promised, weeping as she walked away from the snow cave. Tamsin Donner, George's wife, was strong enough to travel, but George was dying of gangrene from an infected hand injury. Tamsin looked at her husband and then at the rescuers. "I will not leave him," she said. She kissed her children goodbye and sent them with the rescuers, but she stayed behind to die with her husband. The first relief party marched away, a line of ragged children stumbling through the snow, leaving half their family behind in the pits of despair. Chapter 13. The Starved Camp. The journey out was a nightmare. The children were weak. They cried constantly. The rescuers had to carry them on their backs. Halfway down the mountains, they met the second relief. Leading it was James Reed. In the middle of the snowy wilderness, Reed reunited with his wife, Margaret, and 2 of his children. They collapsed into each other's arms, but Reed realized 2 were missing. "Where are Patty and Tommy?" he asked. "They are still at the cabins," Margaret sobbed. "They couldn't walk." Reed, fueled by a father's desperation, pushed his team harder. He raced up the mountain toward the lake. When Reed arrived at the cabins on March 1, the scene had devolved into pure horror. The hide glue was gone. The people who remained had begun to consume the bodies of those who died after the first relief left. Reed found his daughter Patty sitting in a snowbank. She held a small doll. "I knew you would come back, Papa," she whispered. Reed gathered up 17 more survivors. He stripped the cabins of the last scraps of food. He told those remaining, mostly the Donner family at Alder Creek, that a third relief was coming soon. He started down the mountain with his group. But the weather, the eternal enemy of the Donner Party, struck again. A massive blizzard hit the Sierra Nevada. Reed and his group were trapped in a small depression in the mountains known as Starved Camp. For 2 days the storm raged. The fire melted the snow beneath them, creating a 20-foot deep pit of slush and freezing water. The wind screamed. The food ran out. When the storm cleared, 5 people were dead. The survivors at Starved Camp were delirious. In the pit, amidst the screaming wind, the survivors began to eat the dead. A mother was forced to eat the body of her own child to survive. James Reed, nearly blind from snow glare and freezing, managed to lead a handful of the strongest out, but they had to leave the rest in the pit. Chapter 14.
The Third Relief. March 1847. Two men, William Foster and William Eddy, survivors of the forlorn hope who had recovered, led the Third Relief. They were desperate. They had left their children at the lake and at Starved Camp. They hiked up the mountain on snowshoes, racing against time. They reached Starved Camp first. It was a scene from Dante's Inferno. The survivors were lying in the bottom of the pit, too weak to move. They were surrounded by the mutilated bodies of the dead. They found their own children among the dead. Their hearts broke, but they had to keep moving to the lake to save the rest. When they reached the cabins at the lake, the silence was absolute. Tamsen Donner was still alive. She was weak but lucid. She had wrapped her dying husband George in a clean sheet. She refused, once again, to leave him. She told Foster and Eddy to take her 3 little girls. "Save my babies," she said. The Third Relief took 4 children. They left Tamsen Donner sitting by her husband's side, holding his hand as the fire burned low. They left Louis Kasberg, the German, who was suffering from a foot injury and couldn't walk. As they left, Tamsen watched them go. She was the last noble soul on the mountain. Chapter 15. The Monster in the Cabin. April 1847. The Fourth Relief. The snow was finally melting. A month had passed since the Third Relief left. The Fourth Relief wasn't really a rescue party. It was a salvage party. They expected everyone to be dead. They were coming to collect the Donner money and goods. They hiked into the camp. The snow had receded enough to reveal the full extent of the horror. Bones were scattered everywhere. Skulls, ribs, vertebrae. They approached the Murphy cabin. The door creaked open. A man stepped out. He was wild, with long matted hair and a beard infested with lice. He was leaning on a stick. It was Louis Kasberg. He was the only one left alive. The rescuers looked inside the cabin. It was a slaughterhouse. There were buckets of blood. There were pots boiling on the fire containing human flesh. And there in a pan was the liver of Tamsen Donner. The rescuers were repulsed. One of them, William Fallon, put a gun to Kasberg's head. "Where is the Donner money? You killed her for the money, didn't you?" Kasberg fell to his knees. He wept. He claimed Tamsen had died naturally of the cold, and he had eaten her only to survive. He said she had come to his cabin after George died, delirious and freezing, and passed away in the night. "He honored her," he sobbed. "She was the best woman I ever knew. I ate her to live." The rescuers found the Donner gold buried near the cabin, exactly where Kasberg said it was. They didn't shoot him, but they looked at him with a mixture of pity and revulsion that would follow him for the rest of his life. They gathered up the gold, they packed up some artifacts, and they walked Louis Kasberg, the last survivor of the Donner Party, down the mountain.
Chapter 16. The Aftermath. The Statistics of Doom. Total party. 87 people entered the mountains. Survived, 48. Died, 39. Cannibalism. Of the 87, roughly 21 people were eaten by the 48 survivors. The fate of the survivors. James Reed, the man who was banished for murder, became a hero of the rescue. He settled in San Jose, California, became a wealthy real estate developer, and the streets of San Jose today are named after him and his family members: Reed Street, Margaret Street. The Donner children. The children of George and Jacob Donner were adopted by various families in California. They grew up, married, and had children,
but they rarely spoke of the winter of 1846. Virginia Reed. She kept a promise she made to God on the mountain. She converted to Catholicism and lived a long, pious life. Louis Kesselberg, the last man, lived a cursed life. He opened a restaurant in Sacramento, which failed due to dark rumors about the meat. He was shunned by society. He died poor and alone in a hospital, swearing until his last breath that he never killed Tamsen Donner. The site today. If you drive on Interstate 80 through California today, you will pass through the Donner Pass. It is a beautiful, scenic highway. Near the lake, there is a monument. It is a large stone pedestal topped with a statue of a pioneer family looking west. The pedestal is exactly 22 feet tall. That is the height the snow reached during that terrible winter. When you stand at the base and look up at the feet of the statue, you are standing where the cabins were buried. You are standing in the snow hell. The Donner Party is not just a horror story. It is the ultimate test case of the human animal. It asks the question that sits uncomfortable in the back of every mind. If you were starving, freezing, and watching your children die, what would you do? Most of us like to think we would die with dignity. The history of the Donner Party suggests otherwise. The end.